I mentioned in the last video that reading is my passion. I love doing it. I think it's the best way to integrate language in language learners, in kids with language difficulties, because it's fun, it's interesting, and it's important because they need to learn how to read so they can succeed as they move into bigger grade levels. All right, let me go ahead and get started today. So the first thing that we're going to be talking about today is asking questions. And I know that it seems like such an easy concept, and a lot of us do it naturally when we're reading books. But one thing that I've noticed when I was a coach last year was that a lot of the language facilitators would ask questions like, oh, what color is the birdie? And that's great because you're asking a question about what's happening in the book, you're involving the student, but there are better questions that you can ask to facilitate more language, and that's the goal of this lab and of being a speech language pathologist in general. So I'm going to get into how to ask a little bit more variety of questions and how to scale the questions from simple to complex so that you're able to implement this to students as needed. So the first thing that I always think of when I think of questions is car questions. I have heard other people use car questions with a different definition, something like comprehend, ask, and respond. But I learned it this way in undergrad, that it's comprehension, abstract, and reflection. And those are the three different types of questions you're going to be asking, right? So let's get into what each of these means. So comprehension questions is, does the child understand what's happening in the story? And again, that can range from simple to complex. So this is an example of, hey, what color is his shirt, right? You understand that his shirt is this color. But again, that's not the best question because there's only one word. There's not really much you can elaborate upon that because you're going to be like, what color is his shirt? And the kid's going to say red. And you're going to be like, cool. And then it's just awkward and you have to move on to something else. And so a couple of better simple questions you could ask is like, where is the bird? What is he eating? Because that's going to require the child to look a little bit closer at what's happening in the book, and they might have to draw conclusions because if the bird flew into a nest, maybe the kid is going to say, oh, he's in a tree. And you could say, okay, yeah, he's in the tree, but where is he in the tree? And then you can talk about the leaves, you can talk about the nest, you can talk about how you make a nest, you can look at what's inside of the nest. And so you can really get into more of the book and more of a discussion about it instead of just drilling like, what color is his shirt? What's this? What's that? Because those just aren't really the most effective. For complex questions, comprehension questions is like, who is that? Or what did he do first? And the reason why these are more complex is because you have to draw an inference, and inferencing is pretty hard, especially at this age. So if, for example, you're reading a story about a kid who is afraid of the dark and can't fall asleep, and then a woman comes in and tucks him in and leaves the room, but it never says like who it is. You could ask like, who is that? And the kids could have to infer like, okay, so it's the middle of the night, somebody's tucking him in. Maybe it's a mom, maybe it's a babysitter or a grandma or a grandpa. And so you're gonna have to use the context clues from the rest of the story to figure out who that person is. And so that's an example of how you can test if the child understands what's happening, because if they've been following along, they should be able to say, oh, okay, it said at the beginning of the story that his parents went out to dinner, so it's probably the babysitter. But if they weren't understanding what was happening and they say, oh, it's his sister, then you can go back and break down, oh, well, remember first the parents went out to dinner and then they went to bed and then he got scared and then somebody tucked him into bed, but it couldn't be his parents. They're at dinner. Huh, it couldn't be them. Has anybody ever tucked you in bed while your parents were gone? And then a lot of them have experience with the babysitter, so they'll be able to make that connection. With an inference, which is where we're getting with these more complex questions, you have to be able to combine the clues in the text with your background knowledge. And so usually kids don't necessarily have the hardest time finding the clues. Usually it's a problem with the background knowledge. They've just never experienced that before. And so if you're reading in a large group setting and one kid doesn't really understand what's going on, like he's never had a babysitter before, maybe another kid in the group does, and then they can help provide that background knowledge for the kid who has never experienced that, which is another really great reason why we ask more complex questions, because it gives kids exposure to different ideas that they might have never even thought about before. Another one is, what did he do first? The reason why this is more complex is because they have to go back a couple, and also those positional words of like first, second, third, kids are just starting to get that. And so by saying, what did he do first, they have to not only remember what first means, but then they have to go back and remember the order of the story. If you are going to do a question like that, I would do it in more of a repetitive story. So if it was like, there was an old lady who swallowed a fly, you could, read through the story, and because it's so repetitive, you could be like, what did she swallow first? And if they don't say a fly, then obviously they didn't understand, because that is said literally every single page. And so that would be an example of when you would have to go back and break it down a little further for them. So when, why, and how do you use comprehension questions? So you're going to use them throughout the story to check for understanding. I wrote in here especially for longer or more complex books. For preschoolers, books are never going to be super long, but you get the vibe of when a book is just like a board book and pretty short, you're going to need less of them because it's geared towards a younger audience. But when you start getting into more advanced stories, picture books, for example, like the Martin Luther King unit, those books are pretty long. It has a lot of new information that the kids have never heard before. And so it's going to be really beneficial to stop every few pages and just ask a comprehension question to make sure that the kids are following along. Because if you read this whole story to them and you just assume they understand what's happening, you get to the end and you're going to be like, okay, what was the book about? And the kids are going to be like, well, there was a guy and he marched, but they might not really understand the nuances of it. So that's why it's important to stop and ask age appropriate comprehension questions to make sure that they understand what's going on. And again, ask more of these when you have a child with language difficulties, because especially for kids with language disorders, they require 3 times the exposure of a typically developing child in order to gain new vocabulary words, and they're going to have a lot of trouble with grammar. And so if you can stop and give them time to think and process what's happening and ask and answer questions, then the child's going to not only get a more concrete view of whatever vocab you're introducing and whatever grammar you're introducing, but they're also going to be able to be engaged more with the story, because they might check out if they don't really understand what's happening. And as I mentioned on the last slide, it's beneficial if you have a large group, because then if that child with language difficulties can't answer the question, one of the other children can help supplement and give them more of an insight as to what's happening, because information when it comes from a peer is typically more impactful than when it comes from an adult, just because socially you want to fit in with your peers. And so when the kids are interacting, usually they have really positive benefits. Another note is that you should sandwich these between harder questions, because they are easier to answer, especially the simple ones, right? So if you're asking like, oh, where are they? And they're like at the zoo or something, that might still be like a little bit of an inference if it doesn't say like outright that it's a zoo, but most kids have been to a zoo. They know what zoo animals are. People drill zoo animals into kids from like babies. And so if you're able to slide some of those easier questions in between the abstract and reflection questions, it can make them feel like they're participating and they're being successful. If you're asking too many difficult questions back to back, then they're going to think that they're being drilled. They're going to think they're doing something wrong. They might get confused or bored because they're like, hey, I just want to hear a story, lady. I don't want to have a test. So you need to find that balance of simple, complex questions, a variety of the car questions, and but also making sure that the reading is fun and not feeling like a drill or a test. And again, my final note on this slide is don't ask too many of these. It's so easy to fall into a trap of just asking like yes, no questions or one word answer questions. And it's okay to have a couple of those, like I said, because you can sandwich them in and make the child feel a little bit better about themselves and their answers. But also, if you're just doing those, you're not getting as much language out of them as you could be. And it's also just not benefiting them as much because, of course, they can tell you what color the guy's shirt is, but just because they know their colors doesn't mean that they're following along with the story, which is essentially the reason why you want to ask comprehension questions in the first place.